Hello, and welcome to this conversation between myself and Steve Taylor. Hi there, Steve.
Hi, Mark.
I'm really glad to get together because I wanted to talk about the notion of the evolution of consciousness, not in the Darwinian sense that, at some point, hundreds of thousands of years ago, probably, consciousness akin to our own started to emerge in Paleolithic times, but something a bit more recent than that, which is the sort of experience of what it is to be human that we have now, and how that has shifted over periods more of cultural time, you might say, than Darwinian time, and particularly given rise to the sort of spiritual perceptions that we have now. I mean, broadly, that is something which you recognise, that there has been some sort of emergence of our consciousness over maybe the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people think of evolution in purely kind of physical Darwinian terms, but right from the beginnings of life, right from the very simplest life forms, the amoebae of millions of years ago, there has been an evolution of consciousness taking place too, and that has manifested. So that has continued into the human race. So the human race is undergoing and has undergone its own evolution of consciousness as a part of that whole process.
So just a little bit more about that. So that what you're saying there is that different life forms would have a different kind of consciousness, and that ours is connected somehow, or ours emerged along a kind of separate trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you define consciousness, but I would define consciousness in terms of awareness. To some degree, I think consciousness includes awareness. So the very simplest life forms have some degree of awareness. The very simplest bacteria will move towards sources of food or towards light or heat. So they obviously have some kind of sensory awareness, very basic awareness of their surroundings. So as life forms become increasingly complex, as more and more cells get together and there are more interconnections between those cells and increasingly well organized, then consciousness also seems to become more intense. So that sort of tiny flicker of awareness grows in every life form as every life form becomes slightly more complex. So that process continues right into the animal kingdom, right up to human beings. So, maybe there are other animals like dolphins or whales who have a similarly high degree of awareness to human beings. But so I think, in my view, we're part of that whole process, that whole evolutionary process from, right from the beginnings of life. But, but I agree with you that there are significant points in the development of human consciousness over the last few thousand years.
Yeah. So maybe a good place to sort of pick up on that is to think about the different consciousnesses between, say, prehistoric peoples of one sort or another, perhaps of which there are echoes in indigenous peoples today, and how a more modern consciousness is like that, differentiates from that. I mean, maybe my sort of touch point for this is the writings of Owen Barfield, the Inklings, who I'm very keen on. And his idea is that maybe around 1000 BC, so, relatively recently we're talking about now, the mode of consciousness is what he called original participation. And by that, he meant that our participation with the rest of the world, I think he primarily meant it was received from the outside in, rather than our mode of consciousness, where we tend to think that consciousness is always somehow primarily going on within us, and then we try and connect out with others. I think he looked to people like the writings of Homer. He looked to the very earliest bits of the Hebrew Bible. He read a little bit about Paleolithic people and Neolithic people, the Bronze Age, that kind of emergence too, and broadly came up with the idea that people's great interest in gods, in spirits, in place as being animated, was because the primary activity, the kind of psychology back then, if you like, was to manage all that liveliness in relation to oneself. But it was a learning to relate from the outside in, and that then began to change sometime during the first millennium BC, and the beginnings of our consciousness, a move away from original participation. And maybe what that move away involved, but again, broadly, is that a kind of account which you would recognize?
Yeah, my view is similar to that. I wrote a book called The Fall, which largely deals with the sort of prehistoric consciousness and how that changed over the last few thousand years. But I would go further back than Barfield. I would say that what Barfield is highlighting or recognizing, they're the kind of the remnants of an earlier consciousness, which is already beginning to fade away. And so the last vestiges of this kind of prehistoric sense of participation. But I would go back further. I would go back right back to maybe 6,000 years ago. You know, the reason my book is called The Fall is because I think of the fall as that was the point in history or prehistory when human beings first developed a strong sense of ego consciousness, a strong sense of individuality. I think early human beings had some degree of identity, some degree of individuality, but a very kind of soft kind of individuality. But the reason I highlight it 6,000 years ago is because there were lots of kind of archeological and anthropological signs that something new was developing at that time. That was and it involves specific groups of people. It involves groups of people in the Middle East and in the steppes of southern Russia. There were sort of some groups of people in that area who seem to develop the first signs of individuality, a strong sense of individuality. So they have individual burials for the first time, individual burials with possessions, and in sort of there are some signs of strong social hierarchy, where certain individuals have a lot of power, a lot of prestige, as if they become separate from the community. And these groups, once they developed this sense of individuality, this sense of heightened individuality, there were lots of kind of like social consequences too. As I said, these groups became hierarchical. This is also the time when warfare became very intense as well. You know, there's a bit of a myth that early prehistoric human beings were very warlike and, you know, prehistoric savages who were very brutal and very aggressive. But that's not really true. There's very little, almost no evidence for warfare until maybe 5,000 BC. And around 4,000 BC and slightly later, warfare becomes incredibly intense and endemic. It becomes a constant feature of human societies, but not until then. So somehow, you know, I believe that the advent of social pathologies like intense warfare, strong social hierarchy, and also male dominance. You know, prehistoric societies wouldn't, you know, they don't seem to have been male dominated. They seem to have been fairly egalitarian in terms of gender. But all of these sort of new cultural trends like warfare, male dominance, hierarchy, they seem to happen in tandem with these new signs of individuality. So that's why, you know, I suggest that these were due to a loss of that sense of connection to nature and also to the community. I think a lot of prehistoric human beings didn't see themselves as separate from their communities. Their sense of identity was completely embedded in the community, just as it was also embedded with nature. So there seems to have been a loss of that sense of connection and community.
I wonder whether there's an intermediate stage that you would buy, which is that certain individuals within the community start to be the focus for that more collective sense of belonging and identity. So, for example, maybe the most obvious example would be the emergence of Egyptian civilization as we now think of it. So this reaches back to you know, maybe 4,000 BC. And you know, very early on, the Egyptian civilization start building these pyramids, and I'm always rather fascinated. This is an inference, but the pyramidical structure tends to mean a kind of gathering from the base to the pinnacle, to the peak of the pyramid. And I'm wondering whether pharaohs were individuals, but who gathered together the identity of all the people in the culture. And it's why to me that makes sense, because to build a pyramid is such an extravagant thing to do. It takes the whole community to do it. The whole economy, as it were, has to be organized around building a pyramid. And to me that makes sense when there's a kind of psychology behind it, which is it's because everybody felt their sense of identity in relation to the pharaoh, and so therefore building the pyramid kind of made sense.
Yeah.
And I think also the other piece just to add in there would be the emergence of what you might call religious specialists. So maybe shamans, that maybe you were touching on this a little bit too, the idea that with special burials that often seem to, my understanding is they often seem to have been shamanic kind of figures, that they weren't collective individuals in the way that, say, kings and pharaohs were. but they were nonetheless seen as kind of intermediary individuals who were somehow in between this world and other worlds. And so differently from pharaohs, they became marked out as kind of individuals. But both pharaohs and shamans weren't individuals in our sense. It wasn't democratic, you might say. It wasn't that everybody started to think of themselves straight away as an individual, but that these particular individuals first have to emerge. And then after that, you gradually get a democratizing of individuality. So again, in Egypt, you gradually see that more and more people start to have individual burials over the millennia of Egyptian civilization. There's some kind of intermediate stage anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think the process of the fall, it was a very gradual one. It began with certain groups, you know, around 4000 BC, and it spread very slowly, intensified very slowly. So I would say that the kind of the peak of the fall was probably maybe 1500 BC, around that time. And so I see polytheism, for example, as in ancient Egypt, and maybe the kind of Egyptian social structures that you're talking about and the role of the pharaoh. I see it as a kind of intermediate stage, because prehistoric human beings were not theistic in the sense that we understand the term. They didn't really believe in gods. They didn't believe in gods who were separate from the world and who overlooked the world. They sometimes have myths of creator gods, but that just seems to be a way of explaining how the world came into being. So once the god creates the world, he sort of steps aside and doesn't really participate in it. But they believe in spirits. Prehistoric human beings seem to have believed that, on the one hand, the whole world was kind of permeated with a spirit force, some kind of spiritual energy, which was manifested in everything, every natural form, and also in human beings, and which filled the air around them. On the other hand, they believed in individual spirits as kind of like entities or kind of vapors, almost like gases that kind of filled the air and could inhabit life forms and inhabit the human body. But they didn't really have concepts of gods in the sense we understand them. So the first societies with concepts of gods were polytheistic, like ancient Egypt, ancient Sumer. So I see that as a kind of, a step away from spirits and a step towards monotheism, which came a bit later. So I think the development of polytheism was a kind of intermediate step as well.
Yeah, I do get that as well. I think it requires a certain kind of subjectivity to be able to perceive that there might be deities that have a kind of individuality themselves, that sort of sense that a deity that might have a life of its own rather than being embedded in nature or the cosmos too, as a spirit force or an animistic entity. You can only, as it were, perceive what is partly in your own consciousness. If you don't have a powerful sense of being an individual, you're never going to perceive of individual gods, for example.
There's
nowhere for that to land inside you might say. Yes, and so Barfield's point is that individuality, though, does start to emerge. He sees it. His research, if you like, his empirical evidence is in the development of words, and he notes that words start to themselves separate out. That whereas older words have a meaning that is both outer and inner. So a word like pneuma, for example, ancient word ruach in Hebrew for spirit, also means wind and breath. And you can't separate out the meanings in its early usage. But gradually people do learn to separate out these meanings. So they get a sense of spirit within and wind without. So you get that separation that you can track through the development of words. But that must mirror a kind of consciousness, a sense that you're a fall, I think. This is how the fall makes sense to me, that there's a kind of break with the world around that's both a sense of alienation and loss, but also makes for the good side of being an individual, which we obviously appreciate now.
Yeah, I think there are certain parallels with, kind of individual development from childhood to adulthood. I would never say that indigenous peoples are like children. I don't think that's the case. Or prehistoric human beings were akin to children, where there's kind of magical and mythical view of the world. But I think it's more complex than that. But I think there are certain parallels in the sense that, children in our culture at a young age, they don't seem to experience separation. They live in this kind of world of participation. They don't really separate themselves from their experience. And that's why it's so great to be a young child, because you're just immersed in this incredibly vivid world of strange, unfamiliar phenomena. and it's really wonderful. But at a certain point, maybe sort of around the age of 8, and obviously this continues into adolescence, you begin to develop a sense of separation, a sense of individuality. You even begin to develop this kind of voice inside your head, which enables you to think, and which enables you to make plans, but obviously also enables you to think about your own experience and analyze yourself, which brings self-consciousness, which can be tricky to negotiate. But yeah, so there is a kind of fall in our development too. We fall out of this wonderful world of participation that we experience in childhood into adult individuality. But obviously it's a necessary process, because children would not be able to survive in the world. If we remained as 5-year-old children, we just wouldn't be able to function in the world. We need to think abstractly. We need to make plans and decisions. And, there are many useful aspects of the adult, cognitive development. But I think there's a further stage where we need to integrate what we experience as children into our adult development. And I think that applies to us as a species as well. We need to integrate what we experienced in prehistoric times, that kind of sense of connection to nature, that kind of feeling that the whole world is imbued with a spiritual force. We need to recapture that at a higher level to integrate it with a kind of rational, abstract developments, intellectual advances that we've experienced, after the fall.
Yeah, I'm a bit nervous of the notion that ontogeny replicates phylogeny, as it's sometimes put, this idea that the childhood development mirrors evolutionary development. Because, well, actually, it was put to me rather starkly when I went to visit the Lascaux caves, with these famous paintings from about 35,000 years ago or so. And someone said, they're not like children's paintings, are they? And in that moment, I thought, they're not at all, actually. They've got a sophistication that you'd never see in a child. And so whilst I do accept there's a different consciousness produced a painting like that, I think it has its own kind of sophistication. It's just sophistication that's really well tuned to negotiating with this outside-in consciousness rather than the inside-out. So I got a bit more nervous about this.
Well, I agree. That's why I say, I think there are parallels, but I wouldn't say that, the parallels are exact. I think I agree with you that there are many ways in which prehistoric human beings were quite sophisticated in a way that children could never be. Even in terms of their social development, I read an article recently about how the American ideals of democracy were kind of borrowed from Native American societies. A lot of Native American groups had very well developed notions of equality and democracy, far beyond any notion of that was common in Europe at that time. There was a League of Iroquois, which was basically a League of Nations, where tribes would organize themselves and make decisions based on common consensus. And the founders of the American Constitution borrowed a lot of these ideas, from their interactions with Native Americans, and also the principles of equality, gender equality in Native American societies. And they weren't just accidental principles; they were quite rational principles. Even they had a lot of prehistoric hunter-gatherer tribes, including tribes which still exist nowadays, have very well developed principles of preserving equality in the community by ostracizing alpha males, who threaten to disrupt the harmony of the community, which is quite a very rational democratic process. Their decision-making process is very rational and democratic. Nobody is allowed to, in some societies, nobody's allowed to nominate themselves as a leader. Nobody's allowed to say, I want to be the leader, vote for me, as in our societies. Leaders are chosen by other members of the group. So whether they want to be leaders or not, they have a responsibility to make decisions on behalf of the group. So it's, in some ways, it's more rational than our political principle.
I like that, because also for me, what that does is it says that these earlier consciousnesses have really got something for us. They're not something we've moved on from, which sometimes in these kind of accounts of the evolution of consciousness, so the word primitive is, I guess, the obvious way to pin that. I think that there's a consciousness back then, which in a way our task now is to learn how to appreciate once more, but with also the gains of individuality, which, have its own set of advantages too. So it's an incorporation or an integration rather than a kind of linear development.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the fall was in some ways a rise. It was a development. It was a leap. It was a development. A lot of, at the same time as being a period when a lot of pathological cultural developments occurred, like warfare, social hierarchy, male domination. it was also a period when there were a lot of amazing technological developments. You know, that was the positive side of it, this new kind of capacity for abstract thinking, logical thinking, this new capacity for ingenuity and invention. So yeah, and it was also that, I think that kind of individuality also gives you a capacity for creation, for individual creativity as well. And philosophy, you know, it gave rise to philosophy, as in the ancient Greeks, for example, that ability to analyze yourself and analyze the world around you. So these were the positive sides of it. So yeah, so we need, as you say, we need to integrate these with the sense of participation that we lost, or the sense of the sacred, which we've lost. Now, I think that is the next stage of the evolution of consciousness in human beings. It's the recapturing and the integration of those two phases.
Yeah, so maybe picking up on that and just, you know, picking up our loose-ish timeline, if we've got to, say, the ancient Greeks, ancient Hebrews around the Mediterranean world, no doubt parallels in India, like with the Buddha, for example, or Lao Tzu and Taoism in China. But I think there is this sense, this emergence of the individual that's relating to the whole, which in monotheistic cultures develops into monotheism, say around about 500 or so BC. And then in Christianity, which is just happens to be the spiritual tradition I know the best, you know, given where I'm born and so on. I think that in this is Barfield's idea that in antiquity and then in the medieval period, you get what he called a reciprocal consciousness emerged, which is one of the most well-known summaries of it is that there's a microcosm that mirrors the macrocosm. And so the individual can know a rich kind of cosmological type inner life that they then see mirrored or echoed in the inner life of the cosmos as a whole. So in medieval Christianity, like in Dante's Divine Comedy, there's a great interest in the planetary heavens, as it was thought of then, kind of different levels of paradise, which Dante can rise through as his inner consciousness is shaped by his interactions with Beatrice and so on, as he rises through paradise. So that reciprocal consciousness, where there's a full individual sense, but with potentially, at least maybe in the spiritual geniuses of the times, but nonetheless the potential is to be able to share in the life of the cosmos as a whole. I think you get that in the early Greek philosophers as well, and people wrote about Epicurus as if his mind could traverse the whole cosmos. So this reciprocal notion emerges.
Yeah, I agree. You get it all over the world. You get it in ancient Hinduism, ancient Hindu philosophy. You know, this sense of reconnection almost, this sense of, I think there was a sense that a lot of people began to sense that they had lost something. They had lost that sense of connection. And I think even something like the discovery of meditation as a tool to transform consciousness, it was a way of reconnecting. I think people discovered meditation at roughly the same time in India and ancient China. There were sort of techniques of meditation described. And I think it was a discovery that people kind of ached for that sense of connection again. You know, they experienced this intense sense of individuality, but something inside them sort of longed to reconnect, and meditation was developed as a tool of reconnection. And also the spiritual paths of yoga, Taoism, ancient Taoism, I think they were sort of tools of reconnection. I think they were methods of reconnection. And I think mystics throughout the ages, Christian mystics, definitely in the Middle Ages, like the German mystics like Meister Eckhart, they experienced that too. That, you know, they had this sense of reconnection. They had this sense that, you know, they weren't just individuals. They were part of the whole cosmos, that the essence of their being was also the essence of every other living being and the essence of the universe. And yeah, so I think there has been this process of reconnection. In fact, I call it the transfall process, the transfall movement, this movement beyond the fall towards reconnection and integration. I think even on a social level, you know, I think of the sort of the latter half of the 18th century as a very significant time in the evolution of consciousness. I think you've talked about this too, about the Romantic movement. I think the Romantic movement is part of it.
Yeah, so this is moving into the modern period now, and you know, after the Reformation in the West, the scientific revolution, a bit more of a global phenomena, the Enlightenment, again, a bit more of a global phenomena. So I sort of think that is almost like another fall. It's another process of alienation, the death of God, as Nietzsche finally sort of summarized it, that has its own sense of loss, you know, even to the point that people can become atheists, I think, properly for the first time. and the sense of the meaning crisis that many people are engaged with today. Maybe a lot of mental health problems and so on are related to this. But again, I think there must be an upside, which is that with an intensification of the individual through the suffering, as it were, that we may be moving into a phase where there's a new sense of participation in cosmic life, in divine life, and that the romantic movement, as you suggested it, as you raised it there, I think these were the early signs of a new kind of participation. So, for example, he starts to sense something more deeply interfused. It's probably a sort of recovery, but people like Barfield felt that it must be also something, another sort of step onwards, as it were, another kind of consciousness beginning to emerge. With the advantages of all that science can tell us, but linking into a participative experience of what is connected. And it's become quite crucial with the ecological crisis. I think it's not just the have. We're really feeling the need for that kind of sense.
It's essential for our survival. And, I think the end point of materialism is catastrophe. There's no other way. It's the logical, inevitable end point of a kind of desacralized, over-individuated conception of reality. But going back to the 18th century, it was also a time of a sudden sort of emergence of compassion and empathy as well. It was a time when, the animal rights movement began in Europe, in England especially. It was a time of the women's rights movement began, ideals of democracy and equality, also the anti-slavery movement. So there was this sudden sort of upsurge in compassion. It was almost as if human beings, for the first time, were developing this ability to kind of enter each other's subjective space, this kind of intersubjective capacity to actually, sense what other human beings were experiencing, which is a source of compassion and altruism. So that seemed to be, I think that's a very significant development, this new sense of compassion and empathy, as almost as barriers were breaking down between individuals. So I think it was a process of transcending separation. I think the movement in the evolution of consciousness, which has been happening over the last 2 or 3 centuries, is a transcendence of separation. And it's manifested itself in the ecology movement, this sense of connection to nature. It's manifested itself in increasing empathy and compassion, which means connection to other human beings or other animals. And even in a new sense of connection to the body, particularly over the last 100 years or so, this new kind of integration and acceptance of the human body and transcendence of sexual repression. So I think all of these are signs of a transcendence of separation. And at the same time, as you suggest, there are kind of like opposing movements which seem to be moving in the opposite direction. There's this kind of polarization of increasing transcendence separation and increasing kind of rigidity of the ego. So, on the one hand, we've got this transcendence of the ego. On the other hand, we have this kind of increasing rigidity of the ego.
Yeah, I mean, I see that worked out very directly in psychotherapy. I work much of the time as a psychotherapist, and there's quite a pull there between a much more kind of clinical psychotherapy, you might say, which broadly has a material worldview, that, as it were, something's gone wrong, we can't quite fix it with psychiatric intervention, so a talking cure can kind of facilitate a drug intervention, but that the goal, as it were, is to get someone back to work, for example, which is no mean goal. I mean, that can really help people, so I'm not being sniffy about it, but just to say it's rather limited in terms of its goals. But then there'd be another side of psychotherapy which would maybe see the problem that someone's facing as actually the way through to a completely different sense of life, a transformed sense of life. As you sometimes hear in Buddhist circles, the obstacle is the way. I think the Christian equivalent is that it's by dying we rise again, or taking up your cross, as it were. So it's seeing the problem not as something to be resolved to return you just to a broadly material perception of life, but is actually the way through to a new spiritual perception of life. I see the struggle in psychotherapy over these different interpretations of what treatment might be about as part of this new emergence. So, and it's very interesting in psychotherapy that the post-Freudian traditions, I think, are increasingly speaking to the post-Jungian traditions, and that in itself speaks to a kind of integration.
I think it's similar in psychology. I kind of recognize that There is an increasingly strong kind of neuroscientific perspective, which treats the mind as a product of the brain, and mental health problems are kind of essentially brain problems that can be fixed by medication. But on the other hand, there's a kind of more holistic perspective which is developing, you know, in areas like mindfulness and nature-based therapies, ecotherapy, for example. So yeah, there's this kind of polarization there as well. I think a lot of psychologists are realizing, and psychiatrists and doctors as well, that, you know, mental health issues are much more complex than simply being neurological issues. So,
and I think they're more complex because the transpersonal element must be linked in somehow. That things like dreams, like synchronicities, the experiences people might have on psychedelics, as well as in other kind of states of consciousness, that seem to be saying to us, there's life out there as well as life in here. That's kind of where the vanguard is for me at the moment, and of course ecology as well. And there's
I mean, essentially, the neuroscientific perspective is that it's basically a hyper-individualistic perspective. You are an individual. We can treat you as an individual in separation from your environment, from your community, and from the natural world. But that's, you know, there's this problem. I think there's an awareness that that perspective doesn't work, that you have to see the individual embedded within their social network, within their environment, even within the whole cosmos.
Yeah, and even in neuroscience, actually, there are some people that talk about the brain being an open system. So they're beginning to realize that the brain relates to the body, relates to the environment, relationships matter, that the brain is where it's just one node in a network. Sometimes it's called the social brain. So the brain is a kind of access point to understand this broader network. There'd be a growing movement within neuroscience.
Yeah. So by the way, how do you see the kind of the future evolution of consciousness, you know, beyond our present time and, you know, maybe even beyond the human race?
Yeah, well, I think that there are hints from the Romantic movement. I think there are kind of, Barfield was certainly influenced a lot by Rudolf Steiner, the sort of the German mystic and philosopher who he saw as kind of maybe a generation or two on, and that the test of it for him will be, well, what actually Steiner called a spiritual science, which I think Steiner meant a kind of a way of engaging with spiritual life that's quite as ordered and well understood as science is able to engage with physical reality. And so again, I sort of see psychotherapy as the beginnings of that psychotherapy offers you a range of models by which you can engage with what someone is bringing you in the therapy room, and that maybe they can become a range of models that help us to engage with what Barfield called the inner life of the world as a whole. You know, consciousness is not just something going on inside our head, stuck onto the rest of it, but it is a reflection of the inner life of the cosmos as a whole. So that sort of, when I see developments in that direction, I think, that's the way that we should be headed.
Yeah.
So discernment's a key issue for me. So you know, psychedelic experiences are great, but they tend to sort of blast people, and then they're left struggling with how to integrate it into their ordinary life, and it's risky moment because you can get hooked onto peak experiences and so on. But knowing that sense of the inner vitality of all things in the everyday way, I think is actually a spiritual development rather than just a kind of spiritual revolution.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think there is a process of the evolution of consciousness. Well, it's always taking place, but I think it's kind of intensifying to some degree at the moment. And I think the next few decades are going to be really interesting. They could be catastrophic, but they could also lead to significant evolutionary developments in terms of human consciousness. I think there is this process of increasing transcendence of separation, increasing interconnection. And yeah, I like the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin, the French philosopher, evolutionary philosopher, even though I don't think we're necessarily heading towards a final kind of omega point, a final culmination, but I think there's this ongoing process of increasing interconnection. I think one day, we will recapture that original sense of participation, but in parallel, in harmony with our new intellectual, abstract, logical abilities and so on. So, I'm optimistic about the future. I'm pessimistic and optimistic because I think there is this evolution of consciousness underway. And I think it's very important for us as individuals to contribute to that too, which I think we do through spiritual practice, through following spiritual paths, whatever they may be, or spiritual techniques like meditation, through expanding or intensifying our own consciousness. In some small way, we contribute to the whole human race's spiritual development. Our own individual spiritual evolution contributes to the collective evolution of the human race.
Yeah, I agree, because it's a participative enterprise, and people have to experience it to know it. It's the kind of thing which you can only know by having experienced it. So once one person experiences it, that becomes possible for others too.
Yeah, and because we're all interconnected, what happens within my being in some way is connected to every other human being. So there is this kind of like inner, deep level of the psyche where we share this shared consciousness, or the shared sense of being. So, what happens to us all as individuals is in some way experienced by other individuals.
Yeah. Look, let's draw things to a close there now. That seems like a good point. So thanks very much indeed. I've enjoyed this run through a bit of deep evolutionary time, and asking where we are now too.
Yeah, we've covered like a few thousand years in about half an hour. It's pretty good going.
Cheers for now.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.